pick up your cross and drag it up the hill. His question is, what's at the top of the hill? He doesn't hear that. God.
Well, that's because he hasn't listened to the times when I've been talking about it, I guess, because I've said it repeatedly. You stumble uphill with your burden towards the city of God. That's the story.
What does that mean, the city of God, to you?
I would say that that's a place where everyone bears maximal responsibility and speaks the truth. That's what it is. And what's the responsibility? You're responsible for the suffering in the world. You're responsible for the malevolence in the world. And you're responsible for the veracity of your utterances. Right. And in the city of God, you're maximally responsible for the suffering. You're maximally responsible for the malevolence. And you speak the truth. That's what it is.
Whereas if you're speaking from yourself, then in some sense, you're the only person who could be saying that. And so what that means in some sense is that you've taken ideas, philosophical, even ideological, and you've made them personal so that you're speaking from a position that only you can speak from. And then you have something original to offer. But it's if you can predict what someone is going to say on the basis of their set of beliefs, then they're not speaking. The ideology is speaking. And if the ideology is speaking, you don't even have to listen to them. You could just read about the ideology and make up your own mind. People might need what's unique about you, because each person has something that's unique to them to bring into being. And if they hide that, they hide their light under a bushel, then everyone is poorer for it. And you do that in part, as Solzhenitsyn says, by turning over your God-given soul to human dogma. It's a very bad idea. Everything I touch turns to dirt. Everything turns against me. Like, what's up with the nature of reality? Cain's essential vulnerability is revealed and exacerbated by his pathological attitude towards his own actions. God says to him, essentially, sin is a predatory cat that crouches at your doorway and leaps on you at will. But if you only wanted to, you could master it. And that is absolutely the last thing that Cain wants to hear. Because if things are going from bad to worse for you, and you're playing a causal role in it, there's nothing more horrible than that someone can do to you, but reveal to you in a way that you can't deny that you're entirely complicit in your own demise. And that's exactly what God does to Cain. And so what does Cain do? Well, the logical thing would be listen, because if the structure of reality itself tells you something, it's best to listen, since there's no way out of it, but that's not what Cain does. Whereas Cain has reacted to his self-consciousness by withdrawing from the infinite, and there's a tremendous danger in that, because it starts to mean that he relies purely on his own devious devices to sail his ship through the shoals of life. He believes, as his arrogance develops, as a consequence of his withdrawal from the infinite, a contact that he can't tolerate because he can't tolerate his own vulnerability, that he's able to deceive the structure of reality itself, to offer second-rate sacrifices to God himself, who can see absolutely everything, because the infinite is absolutely everything, and to prevail nonetheless. Well, needless to say, this does not work. And it doesn't work in an obvious way. If you talk to people and they reveal to you their unnecessary suffering, it's very straightforward to look behind what it is that they have to say. They'll tell you the poor decisions they made in their lives, by his failure to make the appropriate sacrifices and to conduct himself appropriately, that he decides then and there, number one, to destroy his ideal, to reduce the tension that he feels when that ideal exists as a contrast point, and number two, to destroy the favored son of God. And so he goes out into the field and kills Abel. And God comes along and says, "Where's my favorite son?" And Cain says, "I killed him." And it's so interesting to me that that story is placed, really, it's the third story in the Old Testament. It's with the archaic stories. And it's a story that reveals, as far as I can tell, that there are two essential patterns of reaction to the self-conscious, vulnerable conditions of existence. And one is humble approach to infinity with determined attempts to make the appropriate sacrifices. The other is arrogance, resentment, the keeping of everything good for oneself, and the degeneration of the soul into something that's homicidally murderous.
And some of the time you'll actually be engaged in life. And the times that you're engaged in life, you won't notice that you're there. Right? The distinction between subject and object disappears when you're engaged in something that you find meaningful. The purpose of life, as far as I can tell from studying mythology and from studying psychology for decades, is to find a mode of being that's so meaningful that the fact that life is suffering is no longer relevant. Or maybe that it's even acceptable. And I would say as well that people know when they're doing that. You know when you're doing that in part because you're no longer resentful. You think, geez, I could do this forever. Right? There's a timelessness that's associated with that state of being. From a mythological perspective, that's equivalent to brief habitation of the kingdom of God. That's the place where you are that's so meaningful that it enables you to bear the harsh preconditions of life without becoming resentful, bitter, or cruel. And there's nothing that you can pursue in your life that will be half as useful as that.
He's being transformed into a slave, and now he's being sold to work as a slave. So you'd think that would corrupt his character. Because, you know, one of the things, I think this is the case anyways, I think people are always looking for an excuse to have their character corrupted. Because if your character is corrupted, then you get to lie, and you get to cheat, and you get to steal, and you get to betray, and you get to act resentfully, and you get to do nothing. And that's all easy. It's easier to lie than to tell the truth. It's easier to do nothing than to do something. So there's always part of you thinking, well, I need a justification for being useless and horrible, because that'd be a lot less work. And so then if something terrible comes along, you think, aha, that's just exactly the excuse that I was waiting for. And then out all that comes. Then they tell me a story about where they were in some dark place, too much alcohol, too much drugs, not getting along with their father, not getting along with their mother, not having a vision for their life, being nihilistic, whatever little slice of hell they were occupying. They say, look, I've been listening to your lectures, and I've been developing a vision for my life, and I've been trying to take responsibility, and I've been trying to tell the truth, and things are way better. And so that's absolutely perfect. It's the right way forward as far as I'm concerned. And those are people who, they took stock of themselves. They said, I'm in a dark place, and I'm a dark person, and here's some things that this dark person in this dark place could do, little things that they could actually do. I'll clean up my damn room. I'll make my bed. I've had, I don't know how many people have come and told me. It's so strange. They said, well, I started making my bed, and that made all the difference. It's like, well, yeah, you decided to aim up, man. And the first concrete instantiation of that was that you made your bed. And you think, well, that's nothing heroic. It's like, no, but aiming up is heroic. You can set yourself a goal that you can attain, and there's not going to be much glory in it to begin with. Because if you're not in very good shape, the goal that you could attain tomorrow isn't very glorious. But it's a hell of a lot better than nothing, and it beats the hell out of bitterness, and it's way better than blaming someone else. It's way less dangerous. And you could do it. And what's cool about it, there's a statement in the New Testament. It's called the Matthew Principle, and economists use it to describe how the economy in the world works. To those who have everything, more will be given. From those who have nothing, everything will be taken. It's like what's very pessimistic in some sense, because it means that as you start to fail, you fail more and more rapidly. But it also means that as you start to succeed, you succeed more and more rapidly. And so you take an incremental step, and, well, now you can lift 55 pounds instead of 52.5 pounds. You think, well, what the hell's that? It's like, it's one step on a very long journey. And so it starts to compound on you.
Where their allegiances lie. They weren't even valid followers of the Nazi Party, because they put the continued pursuit of death above their own survival, even as an ideology. And that's how ideology degenerates. And part of the reason for that is that the narrower the box that you stuff yourself into, the weaker your character becomes. Because there's nothing left of you. You're just a shell that has demons in it. But you're still the sort of thing that can suffer. And so if you cram everything you are into a box, a small, tight box, and you get rid of everything that doesn't fit, you get rid of everything in you that makes life bearable. And then life becomes unbearable. And then if life becomes unbearable, well then, of course, you're motivated to do nothing but to take revenge on it. Because why wouldn't you? If all you were doing was suffering stupidly and meaninglessly, how could you possibly show a positive face to yourself and to the rest of humanity? Satan was represented as the highest angel in God's heavenly kingdom. So you can think about that as the highest psychological function, who had rebelled against God and was then cast into hell. And the idea, there's an idea that's being expressed by Milton. He was one of the foremost poetic geniuses of the English language, Milton and Shakespeare. And what Milton was trying to understand was, what is the nature of evil? And his representation gathered up the dreamlike theories of evil that had been collected around all of Western civilization for thousands of years. And his hypothesis was this: evil is the force that believes that its knowledge is complete and that it can do without the transcendent. And as soon as it makes that claim, it instantly exists in a place that's indistinguishable from hell. And it could get out merely by admitting its error.
Imagine someone's pursuing a goal, and some of the things they have to accomplish or confront on the way to that goal frighten them, and they start to avoid. You're going to encourage the person to face the challenges that are making them afraid, to face them voluntarily. Okay, now let's recast that in archetypal language and make it into a kind of ultimate. So if you want to become everything that you could be, then you look into the abyss itself, which is the darkest place that you can possibly contemplate. By voluntarily doing that, then you call upon the strongest part of yourself to respond. It's like an answer to Nietzsche's conundrum. If you look long enough into an abyss, then the abyss looks into you. It's like, well, if you look long enough into an abyss, past when the abyss looks into you, you see who you could become in the form of the great ancestral figures nested inside the catastrophe of life. Like, it's a bad sign not to be able to take a joke, even at your expense. And I think the reason for that is that, let's say you're about to do something important and you trip a little bit, and so you kind of lower yourself, and you laugh and other people laugh, and what you're indicating is that you can accept the fact that you're imperfect. And so what you do when you accept that fact is you simultaneously elevate yourself, because you say, well, I'm clearly the thing that can make the mistake, but I'm also clearly the thing that can recognize the mistake and put it in its proper context and transcend it simultaneously, which is exactly what someone who can take a joke does.
Which is an indication of status as opposed to the inverse. Right?
Well, it's an indication of the existence of the thing that produces status. That's that capacity for transcendence. So that's why, in some sense, the fool or the trickster is the precursor to the savior, because there's wisdom, there's real wisdom in that ability to. You think, I'm laughing at myself. It's like, that's a very strange statement. It's because you're dividing yourself into two parts there. It's the fool part, that's the thing you're laughing at, and there's the thing that's laughing. And you're privileging the thing that's laughing, and the thing that's laughing is the thing that can take the joke and move on. And people admire that, as they should, because it's an indication of your ability to transcend, to transcend your foolish limitations. And so it's very likely that the idea of the trickster will emerge, because the humorist is always on the cusp between foolishness and wisdom, always. That's the right place for them. That's what stand-up comics do. You can just watch them.
The truth of the matter is that you have a lot of potential as a child, but none of that is capable of manifesting itself as freedom before you become disciplined. And discipline is a matter of the imposition of order, and the order is necessary, especially for people who are hopeless and nihilistic. And lots of people are hopeless and nihilistic. Way more people than you think. And part of that is because no one's ever really encouraged them. And so the book is in part a matter of encouragement. It's like, lay a disciplinary structure on yourself, get the chaos in check, and then you can move towards a state that's freer, because it's discipline first. Like, look, if you're going to become a concert pianist, there's going to be several thousand hours of extraordinarily disciplined practice. That's the imposition of order on your potential, let's say. But what comes out of that is a much grander freedom. And so in virtually every freedom that you have in life that's true freedom is purchased at the price of discipline.
Those are not different. And, there's this idea that not only was Christ the incarnate spirit, right, so fully descended into the body, let's say, but that he also took the sins of the world onto himself. And what that means is that, psychologically speaking, is that part of spiritual development is to recognize the satanic tendencies that characterize you, and to fully wrestle with them, and
and to integrate them. That's the thing. It's not so much to cast them away. It's to transmute them. You know, and you can see the difference between people who've done that and people who haven't, at least to some degree, because people who haven't integrated the shadow at all are naive. And you can tell that when you look at them, and you can tell that when you talk to them. And because they're naive, they're often resentful as well because they get taken advantage of, right? Because the incarnation is at least a symbolic representation of the idea that the spirit has to fully inhabit the body, right? And that's also a remarkable idea, especially because the spirit, so to speak, the psyche, if you want, flees from the body in terror because the body is the place of mortality and suffering. And so people are disembodied, and it's because, one way of looking at it is because they're too afraid to become fully embodied. And it's no wonder they're afraid. There's reason to be afraid. But the question is, well, what would you be like if you had the courage to be fully embodied? And that's fully incarnate. That's another way of thinking about that. And the idea, the Christian idea, is that the fully incarnate human being is the Messiah. That's the idea. That's a hell of an idea. You know, but it means embracing the horrors of the world. That's what it means. And well, there isn't anything better to have than a problem that's worth solving, like that's really worth solving, right? And so the more of that you take on, the more you have a reason to get out of bed in the morning, no matter what. I think I'm getting up, I'm trudging forward. Doesn't matter what I'm suffering from. I've got things that need to be done. They're necessary. And that gives you that sense of purpose that is the antidote to bitterness. You know, there's lots of different ways to interpret the world, and you can maybe even make a case that there's an endless number of ways to interpret the world. And the problem with that is that it kind of disorients you in terms of what you should be doing. But just because there's a very large number of ways to interpret the world doesn't mean there's a very large number of productive, meaningful, and sustainable ways to interpret the world.
These people that you're comparing yourself to, you don't really know very well. What that means is that you see their shiny outside, but you don't see the reality of their life.
Well, first of all, there's danger in just comparing yourself to others, period, because they're not you, and God only knows what struggles they had to undertake to get to where they were, or what burdens they're currently carrying that you're not aware of. But you can certainly contrast yourself with yourself, and that's a lot better.
The possibility that you can make yourself slightly better on a continual basis is, I think that's something that's accessible to everyone. I think that's equivalent to leading a virtuous life.
If you do not listen to that thing that beckons you forward, you will pay for it like you cannot possibly imagine. You'll have everything that's terrible about life in your life and nothing about it that's good. And worse, you'll know that it was your fault and that you squandered what you could have had.
Always take into account the cost of what you're doing now, right? Because what people tend to think is whatever I'm doing now is risk-free, and here's a bunch of options. It's like, no, whatever you're doing right now has all sorts of risks. You're just blind to them because you've habituated to them. They've become invisible. So if you keep yourself in the fog, then you can't tell when you screwed up. Now that isn't so good because you're still screwing up. You're just too blind, self-blind to notice. Although in the short term, that's less painful. If you make your criteria for success razor sharp, then you know every time you screw up. But that's great because then you could fix it. Or maybe you could adjust your damn plan. Either way, you can fix it. It seems to me you might as well make it the best one you could live in because you don't have anything better to do.
Hey, Jordan Peterson!
These people that you're comparing yourself to, you don't really know very well. What that means is that you see their shiny outside, but you don't see the reality of their life.
There's always people out there who are doing far better than you on pretty much anything you want to imagine. And if all you're doing is seeing yourself in their reflected light, let's say, then it's going to be pretty damn dismal. But it's not a good comparison because, well, first of all, there's danger in just comparing yourself to others, period, because they're not you, and God only knows what struggles they had to undertake to get to where they were, or what burdens they're currently carrying that you're not aware of. But you can certainly contrast yourself with yourself, and that's a lot better. It is the only way. Well, it's also the only way of really measuring anything approximating proper improvement. You can actually tell when you're a little better than you were yesterday.
Right.
And you can actually do that. That's another thing that's so interesting about it, is that you can actually make yourself a little better in some way
pretty much, well, I don't know if it's at every moment, but you can certainly do it every day. Be careful who you share good news with, because you want to share good news with people who are going to be genuinely happy for you, and be careful who you share bad news with, because that's equally tricky. You want someone who will listen to you when you're having trouble and allow you your grief. Beauty calls people to their higher being, I would say, and to make friends with beauty is to introduce yourself very carefully to one of the mysteries of life that make it worth living. There's never been a better time for the majority of people to be alive, and the future, although we're vulnerable and terrible things can always happen to us, it's hard to make a case that the future doesn't look comparatively positive. We're becoming extremely technologically sophisticated, and the world is changing at an incredibly rapid rate, and the only way we're going to be able to manage that in a positive way is if each of us, or as many of us as possible, are capable of making wise and careful and truthful decisions. And if we do that, then maybe things can continue to improve. You don't get people to stand up on their own 2 feet and to adopt responsibility if everything is given to them. And that's a real conundrum. You know, maybe you're in California, see someone speeding down the road in a convertible Porsche, and you think, oh man, what a lucky bastard. And the truth of the matter is that he's thinking about wrapping his expensive sports car around the next cement pillar that he comes close to. You know, you can't tell, and people have hard lives, and even people who are comparatively fortunate have hard lives. And the ideal that you're observing that makes you jealous and resentful is in large part an illusion that's created by your own mind. You have to be careful of what you're jealous of, because you don't really know what it is. And then the other thing that's kind of useful is to understand you're quite different from other people, and you shouldn't be comparing yourself to them, because they're not like you. They don't have your family. They don't have your temperament. They don't have your troubles. They don't have your abilities. The only person that has those is you. One of the rules, I think it's rule 4, is compare yourself to who you were yesterday and not to who someone else is today. And see, that's a game you can win. The possibility that you can make yourself slightly better on a continual basis is, I think that's something that's accessible to everyone. I think that's equivalent to leading a virtuous life. And there is something to be said for virtue and truth. You know, and that is one thing. Another thing that I've noticed about people who've been phenomenally successful is that they really do everything they can to live a truthful life. And you can get a bloody long ways by being honest. You got to know that there are differences in intelligence. It's really important. If you go into a job and you're not smart enough for that job, you're going to have one bloody miserable time. And you're going to make life wretched for the people around you, because you won't be able to handle the position. But what you really want to do, as far as I can tell, if you want to maximize your chances for both success and let's say well-being, is you want to find a strata of occupation in which you would have an intelligence that would put you in the upper quartile. That's perfect. Then you're a big fish in a small pond. And you don't want to be the stupidest guy in the room. It's a bloody rough place to be. So, and you probably don't want to be the smartest guy in the room either, because what that probably means is you should be in a different room. If you want to be the best at what you're doing, bar none, then having an IQ of above 145 is a necessity, and maybe you're pushing 160 in some situations, and maybe that's making you one person in 10,000 or even one person in 100,000. And then also, to really be good at it, you probably have to be reasonably stress tolerant and also somewhat conscientious. Why is it that smart people are at the top of dominance hierarchies? And the answer to that in part is because they get there first, right? I mean, everything's a race, roughly speaking, and the faster you are, the more likely you are to be at the forefront of the pack. And intelligence in large part is speed. That's not all of it is. So if you're moving towards something difficult rapidly, the faster people are going to get there first. You're going to have to put some effort into your life, and you need to be motivated to do that. And so what are the potential sources of motivation? Well, you could think about them in the Big Five manner. You know, if you're extroverted, you want friends. If you're agreeable, you want an intimate relationship. If you're disagreeable, you want to win competitions. If you're open, you want to engage in creative activity. If you're high neuroticism, you want security. Okay, so those are all sources of potential motivation that you could draw on, that you could tailor to your own, you know, your own personality. But then there are dimensions that you want to consider your life across. And so we ask people about, well, you know, if you could have your life the way you wanted it in 3 to 5 years, if you were taking care of yourself properly, you know, what would you want from your friendships? What would you want from your intimate relationship? How would you like to structure your family? What do you want for your career? Well, how are you going to use your time outside of your job? And how are you going to regulate your mental and physical health, and maybe also your drug and alcohol use, because that's a good place to auger down. And that tangles in your incentive reward system. You know, we talked about the dopaminergic incentive reward system, and that's the thing that keeps you moving forward. And the way it works is that it works better if it produces positive emotion when it can see you moving towards a valued goal. Okay, well, what's the implication of that? Better have a valued goal, because otherwise you can't get any positive motivation.
Most creative people fail at producing their creative product and monetizing it, right? So your default position, if you're a creative person, is you're going to fail. And that's because it's hard to come up with something new, and it's hard to present it to the market at the right time, and it's hard to market it. Like, those things are really, really difficult. And so what successful entrepreneurs do is they just keep doing it over and over and over and over and over and over and over. And eventually, if they're fortunate, one of their ideas happens to hit the right place at the right time. Even if your idea is good, that doesn't mean it will be successful. There's so many things that have to be taken into account. So this is partly why persistence, and that's part of conscientiousness, is so useful. It's like, persistence is helpful because it enables you to run many, many experiments. And you need to know that the baseline is failure. You know, it's important, because otherwise you'll blame that on yourself. You know, and some of that's useful because there's probably some things that you could improve about yourself. But it's very difficult to go from 0 to 1, you know.
Stop drinking too much. How do you know if you're drinking too much? You regret what you do when you're drinking. It's interfering with other important goals. It's causing you financial distress. It's getting you in trouble with your friends or your family. It's getting you in trouble with the police. Stop abusing substances if you can, right? If you see that they're hurting you. Physical health. Are you in decent shape? Are you strong and coordinated? And if you're not, you'd be better if you were. You'd feel better, you'd be more effective, you'd live longer, you'd be less sick. And you really see that mount up. Like, if someone's been in shape once in their life, they age way better. And it's also a really good way of maintaining your cognitive ability. Like, you know, you hear about those exercises that you can do online to make you smarter and keep your cognitive ability intact. Yep. Those don't work. There's no evidence that they work. Exercise works. Cardiovascular and weightlifting, you start to decline in your fluid intelligence at about the age of 25. And it's a linear trend downhill, and it can accelerate as you get older. It's just like this, quite ugly. If you exercise, you stave that off. Maintain your relationships and foster them. So when I look at successful people, they're really good at something. They're reliable, right? You can count on their word. They're generous, and they have a wide connection network, which becomes more and more valuable as you get older. So it's one advantage that older people really have over younger people. They have a connection network, and a connection network is
huge.
Well, you could be connected to 1,000 well-connected people. Okay, that means you are connected to the entire world. Right, it's unbelievably valuable. And that's one of the things that's so absolutely remarkable about the situation that I'm in right now. As far as one of the great benefits is I can contact pretty much anybody and they'll talk to me. It's like, really? That's so cool. Having a connection network is of inestimable value. Reliability, generosity, you can work on both of those. Philosophical sophistication, it's very useful because it orients you properly. You have a sophisticated sense of the world. You find, for example, that doing things for other people is actually more rewarding than virtually anything else you can do. You know, when you hear you should be of service to other people. Well, if you actually watch yourself, you pay attention to yourself and you do something that helps someone else and it genuinely helps them, I defy you to find another experience that is that satisfying. It's actually quite stunning how satisfying that is. And so that's a very useful thing to realize. There's no better life strategy. If the ethical argument is put properly, it is by far the most compelling argument. It's like, if you want to have everything you could possibly want and more, then be a good person. The better a person you are, the more likely that is to happen. That doesn't mean that you're completely protected against getting cut off at the knees, but there's no better strategy. When my health fell apart and I was in the hospital or multiple hospitals for long periods of time, I stopped doing everything I was doing. And everything I was doing was difficult. My clinical practice was difficult. The professorial job was difficult. The company I was running was difficult. The writing was difficult. The lecturing was difficult. It was all difficult. And I'm not complaining about the difficulty. I actually loved that. That was fine. I'm not complaining about it at all. But because it was difficult, I have to be in really good shape to do it. And so then I wasn't in really good shape. And so because I wasn't in really good shape and everything I had done was difficult, I didn't know what to do. And I couldn't get back on top of things because it was like trying to jump into a car going 200 miles an hour. It's very easy for us to call people who are doing something that we're not doing stupid. It's like, don't be so sure about that, And it would have been better for me if I would have had a wider variety of skills that weren't so high intensity. I could have had some leisure activities that I got good at. Music might have been good, that weren't so demanding. See, what I tried to do, if I saw something was difficult, I wanted to master it. I was driven to do that, just to see how far I could go in these multiple directions. And that left me vulnerable to one thing. It left me vulnerable to being in a situation where I wasn't healthy enough to manage it.
What are 2 or 3 things that everyone should focus on in their 20s?
Well, it certainly doesn't hurt to be in good physical condition, so we can walk through it. Stop drinking too much. How do you know if you're drinking too much? You regret what you do when you're drinking. It's interfering with other important goals. It's causing you financial distress. It's getting you in trouble with your friends or your family. It's getting you in trouble with the police. Stop abusing substances if you can, right? If you see that they're hurting you. Physical health. Are you in decent shape? Are you strong and coordinated? And if you're not, you'd be better if you were. You'd feel better. You'd be more effective. You'd live longer. You'd be less sick. And you really see that mount up. Like, if someone's been in shape once in their life, they age way better. And it's also a really good way of maintaining your cognitive ability. Like, you hear about those exercises that you can do online to make you smarter and keep your cognitive ability intact. Yep. Those don't work. There's no evidence that they work. Exercise works. Cardiovascular and weightlifting, you start to decline in your fluid intelligence at about the age of 25. And it's a linear trend downhill, and it can accelerate as you get older. It's just like this, quite ugly. If you exercise, you stave that off. Maintain your relationships and foster them. So when I look at successful people, they're really good at something. They're reliable, right? You can count on their word. They're generous, and they have a wide connection network, which becomes more and more valuable as you get older. So it's one advantage that older people really have over younger people. They have a connection network, and a connection network is
huge.
Well, you could be connected to 1,000 well-connected people. Okay, that means you are connected to the entire world. Right, it's unbelievably valuable. And that's one of the things that's so absolutely remarkable about the situation that I'm in right now. As far as one of the great benefits is I can contact pretty much anybody and they'll talk to me. It's like, really? That's so cool.
Anything that's every day is a significant percentage of your life.
Compare yourself to who you were yesterday and not to who someone else is today. One of the things I tell people when they're trying to develop a vision for their life or an implementable plan is make a bad plan. Like, make the best one you can, but don't get obsessive about it. It's like, make a plan, implement it. You'll figure out when you implement it why it's stupid. Exactly. And then you can fix it a little bit. And then you can fix it a bit more. And then you can fix it a bit more. I don't think that I've ever been in a situation where if something wasn't going right for me and I sat and thought, okay, all right, I'm willing to figure out what I'm doing wrong, which is a big thing to think because you never know how much you're doing wrong. It might be something that you really don't want to contend with. But if you clear some space to meditate on that, the probability that you'll figure out something that you did that was stupid, that's bending you and twisting you in the wind, you'll get an answer very, very rapidly. The answer to how you pay for your past sins isn't by jumping off a bridge. Well, how much do you need to be beat up? Enough so you fix the problem. No more than that. Minimal necessary force. Don't hit anything harder than it needs to be hit. That's a good rule of thumb. Is there something I can do now to atone for what I failed to do in the past? So let's say you go over your past with a fine-tooth comb and you decide you're going to take responsibility for everything that you did that was wrong and everything that you failed to do that you could have done that was right. It's like, does that change the world? It's like, depends on how thoroughly you do it. You might say it changes the world like nothing else possibly can. And I think that that's actually right. And that's also a frightening thought because it means that things would be way better than they are if you weren't so damn useless. There's this unlimited power that's associated with genius, but it's constrained. And that's really what the human spirit is like because it has this aspect of the infinite.
When you don't get what you want, then a landscape of questions emerge, and those questions can resonate through different levels of your identity, from the trivial, oh, I told the joke wrong, to the profound, there's nothing desirable about me and I'll be alone for the rest of my life.
It's daunting to even consider that. And then there's the discipline and responsibility that necessitates, which is also daunting. It's like, oh my God, the problem's that serious. I'm really going to have to get my act together in order to not contribute to it, much less solve it. And so the problem is terrible. And then the solution is daunting.
When I commit to something and make sacrifices, if something's valuable, you'll make sacrifices to attain it. And that discovery of sacrifice, it's one of the primary factors separating human beings from animals, because we discovered that we could let go of something we value in the present and we would gain something we value even more in the future. You got to aim at something. It's like, otherwise your life is meaningless. Well, what should you aim at? Well, I don't know. Well, pick something. Aim at it. As you move toward it, you'll get wiser. Then maybe your aim will change. That's okay. But at least it'll change in an informed way. It's like discipline yourself in one dimension. See what happens. Well, that's exciting.
If you do not listen to that thing that beckons you forward, you will pay for it like you cannot possibly imagine. You'll have everything that's terrible about life in your life and nothing about it that's good. And worse, you'll know that it was your fault and that you squandered what you could have had. All right, you got 3 years, man. You're going to live them anyways. Devote those 3 years to setting the world up around you so that it's the best it could possibly be for you. As if you were taking care of yourself, as if you cared for yourself. Well, what would that look like? Let's say, just for the sake of argument, if you figured out where you were, that you could have what would be best for you. Well, what is that? I bet you never asked. People don't ask. And so life comes at them like random snakes and they sort of fend them off. And life goes by and things don't work out the way people expected them to. But a huge part of that is they didn't know where they were because they wouldn't look or didn't know that they should look. Ignorance and willful blindness, right? 2 great catastrophes. And they never figured out where they wanted to go or why. Now, there's a problem with figuring out where you want to go. And the problem is that you make your conditions for failure clear to yourself. And people don't like that. So if you keep yourself in the fog, then you can't tell when you screwed up. Now, that isn't so good because you're still screwing up. You're just too blind, self-blind to notice. Although in the short term, that's less painful. If you make your criteria for success razor sharp, then you know every time you screw up But that's great, because then you could fix it. Or maybe you could adjust your damn plan. Either way, you can fix it. It seems to me you might as well make it the best one you could live in, because you don't have anything better to do.
You can't make yourself interested in something. Interest manifests itself and grips you. That's a whole different thing. And so what is it that's gripping you? And how do you conceptualize that? Is that a divine power? Well, it's divine as far as you're concerned, because it grips you and you can't do anything about it. And so there's a calling in you towards what you're compelled by and what you're interested in. And sometimes that might be very dark and sometimes not. But you're compelled forward by your interest. And so the idea that what moves you away from your country and your father's house and the comforts of your childhood home is something that's beyond you and that you listen to and hearken to. That's exactly right. And you can say, well, I don't want to call that God. It's like, it doesn't matter what you call it exactly. It doesn't matter to what it is, what it's called. It still is.
Let's say you want to become who you could be in the fullest sense. So let's say you're someone who's going to solve some serious problems. Okay, the first thing you have to do is admit to the seriousness of the problems. That's no joke. And so the first thing is just the terror of the problem itself. And that's enough to paralyze you, right? And that's the Hydra, that's the Gorgon with the head of snakes. It'll paralyze you and turn you to stone. That's the basilisk in the Harry Potter series. You look at it and it turns you to stone and lurks underneath everything, right? And it's malevolence and tragedy. And so there's that. And then the next is, well, you're going to take responsibility for that? You're really going to do that, are you? That's a hell of a load, man. And so it's daunting to even consider that. And then there's the discipline and responsibility that necessitates, which is also daunting. It's like, oh my God, the problem's that serious. I'm really going to have to get my act together in order to not contribute to it, much less solve it. And so the problem is terrible, and then the solution is daunting. But the upside of that is like, well, there isn't anything better to have than a problem that's worth solving, like that's really worth solving, right? And so the more of that you take on, the more you have a reason to get out of bed in the morning, no matter what. Think, I'm getting up, I'm trudging forward. Doesn't matter what I'm suffering from, I've got things that need to be done. They're necessary. And that gives you that sense of purpose that is the antidote to bitterness. Okay, well, let's say you want your life to be meaningful. It's like, okay, then what you do matters. It actually matters. So that's an interesting thing. Well, so let's say you go over your past with a fine-tooth comb and you decide you're going to take responsibility for everything that you did that was wrong and everything that you failed to do that you could have done that was right. It's like, does that change the world? It's like, depends on how thoroughly you do it. You might say it changes the world like nothing else possibly can. And I think that that's actually right. You have to allow yourself a certain latitude for error. And that's a useful thing to know too. One of the things I tell people when they're trying to develop a vision for their life or an implementable plan is make a bad plan. Like, make the best one you can, but don't get obsessive about it. It's like, make a plan, implement it. You'll figure out when you implement it why it's stupid. Exactly. And then you can fix it a little bit. Compare yourself to who you were yesterday and not to who someone else is today. The same basic idea, right, is that you have to get your markers for success right, because otherwise you can end up in the situation you described, which is that, like, there's always people out there who are doing far better than you on pretty much anything you want to imagine. And if all you're doing is seeing yourself in their reflected light, let's say, then it's going to be pretty damn dismal. But it's not a good comparison, because you shouldn't just compare. Well, first of all, there's danger in just comparing yourself to others, period, because they're not you, and God only knows what struggles they had to undertake to get to where they were, or what burdens they're currently carrying that you're not aware of. You just don't know any of that. But you can certainly contrast yourself with yourself, and that's a lot better. It is the only way. Well, it's also the only way of really measuring anything approximating proper improvement. You can actually tell when you're a little better than you were yesterday.
Right.
So, and you can actually do that. That's another thing that's so interesting about it, is that you can actually make yourself a little better in some way, pretty much, well, I don't know if it's at every moment, but you can certainly do it every day. It's funny. I mean, you know, obviously, if you have a problem and you think about it, you can think up a solution. And it's not obvious how you do that. You know, I mean, it's not like you know how you're manipulating your neurons or something. It happens of its own accord in some sense, like you can participate in it, I guess, and you can interfere with it, and it seems to take a certain amount of willpower, but it still all happens mysteriously behind the scenes. One of the things that I've been there's lots of different ways to interpret the world, and you can maybe even make a case that there's an endless number of ways to interpret the world. And the problem with that is that it kind of disorients you in terms of what you should be doing. But just because there's a very large number of ways to interpret the world doesn't mean there's a very large number of productive, meaningful, and sustainable ways to interpret the world. And one of the things you do have to do is figure out how you can conduct yourself today so that you don't upset the apple cart in a week or a month or a year. And so, what you do in some sense psychologically is you admit to yourself that your current frame of reference is faulty. And then you start opening the door to a different kind of thinking, which is more creative thinking. It's more lateral thinking. Saying, well, I'm wrong, but that's not necessarily a problem because I could be right if I thought some other way. Well, that's great. Often it works.
Yeah.
And there's almost no end to the utility of trying to figure out which ways that you're wrong.
Yeah.
Because there's lots of them. And every time you discover one, then you don't have to be quite so wrong anymore. That's a really good deal.
Yeah.
The day is like a page in a book. Of course, there's many pages in a book, but the page repeats. And so one of the things I often had my clients do, I'll tell you a little story. I had one client who was spending about 45 minutes a night fighting with his young son about when to go to bed. And so, they weren't having a pleasant time of it because it was just a constant battle. And that's common. Like, it's very common for parents of young children to be locked in a battle that occurs day after day. Sometimes it's around eating, sometimes it's toilet training, sometimes it's general behavioral issues, sometimes it's bedtime. So we did some arithmetic. It's like, okay, 40 minutes a day. So that's 280 minutes a week. So that's, let's say, 5 hours. It's 20 hours a month. It's 240 hours in a year. That's 6 work weeks. That's a month and a half. You're spending a month and a half of work weeks doing nothing but fighting with your son. What makes you think you're going to like him? Right? Well, and you think, well, it's only 40 minutes a day. It's like, don't fool yourself. Yeah. Anything that's every day is a significant percentage of your life. Because you're awake, let's say 16 hours. 5 of those hours are basically maintenance. So you got about 11, and then 7 of those are work. So now you're down to 4. And so if you're spending 15 minutes a day doing something painful and stupid, and you do it every day, it's like 10% of your productive life. And so it's really useful to get, because people think backwards. They think, well, I have a vacation coming up and that's really important. It's like, no, it's not. You're only going to do it once. It's not that important.
Yeah.
How you treat each other at lunchtime, if you eat together every day, that's your life. Yeah. Fix that. Yeah. Get it so that the food's good. Get it so that you're happy with the people that are sitting there. Fix that. It's like, poof, 10% of your life is fixed. Well, you admit that there's a problem first, and then you ask for the minimum necessary intervention, which would be, all right, well, I'd like to move forward on this, some small amount that someone like me could actually manage, and I'd be willing to carry it out. And then you reorient the way you're thinking as a consequence of that, and something usually pops out of the abyss to guide you. Yeah. It's very strange, but it's not really any stranger than the fact that we can think at all, because the fact that we can think is actually very strange. Mm-hmm. It's strange like the fact that we can dream is strange, and that's strange beyond belief that you can dream, and or that something in you dreams, which is a much better way of thinking about it, because it's not like you're really in control of your dreams. Yeah. They just sort of...
The thing about free speech is that, like, I'm not a free speech advocate, let's say. I'm a true speech advocate, which is to say that I believe that people should say what they believe to be true. I think that's your obligation. It's also your right, but it comes with an obligation. But I don't believe that true speech is possible without free speech, because you're just not very good at thinking. And so you have to stumble around when you're first formulating ideas and wander into territory that's not necessarily productive and manifest your biases. And in short, you have to be a fool. And the only way that you improve upon that performance is by, well, first of all, stumbling through it to begin with, and then second, by observing carefully what sort of reactions you're getting and having a dialogue around it so that you can start to sharpen up your ideas and improve their focus and find out where you've made a mistake and all of those things. So a lot of What's necessary with regards to thinking is the freedom to make mistakes.
To do if they want to change the world. The first thing they should do is orient themselves to the good. And that's away from evil, away from malevolence, away from the manufacture of pointless suffering and pain, away from Auschwitz, let's say, and away from the Gulag Archipelago and the terrible Soviet camps and the massive murders that occurred in China. You want to get as far away from that as you possibly can. Whatever direction is away from that is a good direction. And then you also want to contemplate what the highest possible good could look like for you and your family and your society. We already discussed that. And then you need to speak the truth in relationship to that. And then you need to educate yourself. And then you need to shoulder your responsibility. Responsibility is a good thing because it makes you strong. To bear up under it makes you strong. You can turn yourself you can free yourself from your strings and turn yourself into a genuine individual. And then you can shoulder the world. And then you're in a position to make change. As a person like that.
Okay, so that's sort of the materialist end of things. Now there's a Darwinian end of things. And the reason I'm telling you about both of these things is because part of what we need to solve in order to progress properly with this course, we need to solve the problem of exactly what constitutes truth. One way you can progress towards that is to start thinking about things in terms of their tool-like capability. And that's a pragmatic approach, by the way, from a philosophical perspective. The pragmatists, who were very influenced by Charles Darwin, by the way, came to the conclusion at the beginning of the 20th century that truth was bounded by claims of practicality. So, and the question then is sort of like, is your tool that you're using to represent the world or to act on it good enough to do what you're trying to do with it? And then if it's good enough, then your claim is true enough. Now, this is tightly tied to Darwinian philosophy, and the pragmatists recognize this right away. That's the viewpoint that's made up of all the stories that people have told about themselves and the world since the dawn of human consciousness. And that's really, those are the knowledge forms, the stories, that actually constitute the base of culture. Because culture is not so much about what the world is and how to perceive it, as it is about how you should act in relationship to the world. You're embedding yourself in this ancient culture that's there to tell you how you should operate yourself in the world, what you should do, because that's a primary question. You need to know what to do. Human beings need to know what to do, because if you don't know what to do, well, that's a very unpleasant emotional state. And that's partly because it indicates that you're not well adapted to your current circumstances. You know, if you just stand around long enough not knowing what to do, you'll age and you'll die. It's not an effective way of dealing with the world. You have to be oriented towards something.
And a chaotic household would be one where no one has any discipline, no one has any aims, and there's a terrible battle between Cain and Abel going on all the time, right? So life sucks and everything's miserable and we're cynical, and that's what wisdom is. It's like, and there's no point in trying anything because everything's meaningless and who the hell's going to care in a million years, and you're a fool to move forward in any case. It's like, there's your household. Okay, and so now you decide, no, despite all that, I'm going to put my room in order. It's like, you will have a war on your hands. Because the first thing the people around you who are aiming down will do is think, oh, you really, eh? You think you're so much better than we are, do you? You really think that, you and your fancy goddamn plans. It's like, we're going to put every psychological obstacle we can possibly think of in your way. Because if you succeed, even in something that trivial, you shed a very dim light on our existence. And so we're going to do everything we can to take you out. It's a microcosm, it really is. And so to take those microcosms seriously, well, that's what I'm asking people to do. Don't be thinking that your errors aren't linked to hell, because they are. If you look at what happened in the 20th century, the brilliant commentators on the 20th century totalitarian states and all of their atrocities said the same thing over and over. It isn't top-down evil leader manipulating innocent masses. That's not it. It's the moral failings of every single individual, unwilling to say their truth, unwilling to act out what they know to be right, that accumulate and produce the catastrophic state. And so when you're fussing about with your life, when you're not manifesting your potential, when you're falsifying your speech and your actions in the service of short-term expedience, you are working to bring about hell on earth. And that's true.
people think of freedom as the ability to implement your whim. And freedom opens up that as a possibility. But sustainable freedom, that isn't what it's about at all. It's primarily about responsibility. It's about determining which load you're going to pick up and carry. That's the proper definition of appropriate freedom. It's not dim gratification of instantaneous impulse. It's self-evident that that doesn't work. 2-year-olds do that, and that's why they can't live in the world. They can't organize themselves across time. They can't sacrifice the moment for the future. And the more sophisticated you get, I suppose, in some sense, the more you're able to do that. And then your freedom becomes the freedom to choose the proper responsibility. And that's also not something that we've been good at communicating to young people. If we talk to them about responsibility, we generally do it in a finger-wagging sort of way. Talk to me, and then they have, 15 seconds of time to tell me something. I'm really listening to them. And they're hesitant about whether or not to share the good news about their life, And I think it's often because when people share good news about their life, people don't necessarily respond positively. They don't get encouragement. And people need so little encouragement. It's just unbelievable. And so they'll tell me something good, and I think, oh, that's so good. Somebody says, oh, I'm getting along way better with my father. I haven't seen him for 10 years, and now we get along. It's like, God, great. Yeah. And then the power of that, you can't overstate the power of that for individuals to get their life together. The individual is an unbelievably powerful force, and every single person who gets their act together a little bit has the capacity to spread that around them. It's a chain reaction, and so it's a lovely thing to see. And
that's fantastic.
There's a moral order built into human beings. If there wasn't, there's no way we could even communicate with one another, because there'd be no rules of communication. There'd be nothing that we mutually wanted or expected from each other. One of the things I figured out is that we're all appalled when we run into another person who is not yet the Redeemer. Every person you ever meet, you're dissatisfied with because they're not who they could be. And you're broadcasting that message at everyone all the time. You're not who you could be. You're not who you could be. You're not who you could be. I'm not who I could be. And we're all facing each other with our emotional displays, pleading with each other to become that which we could become. And everyone knows it. But we won't do it. And it's no wonder. Just because something terrible happens to you doesn't mean that you get to wander off the path and make things worse. And maybe it doesn't matter how terrible it is that what happens to you. And that's a tough call, because you see people now and then in life who they've really got it rough, man. Like 50 bad things are happening to them at the same time, and you think, oh, it's no wonder. If you were bitter and resentful and hostile, it'd be like, yeah, no wonder. But then you meet people, and Solzhenitsyn again talked about this in the Gulag Archipelago. He said he met lots of people not lots. He met enough people to impress him in the concentration camp system who didn't allow their misfortunes to corrupt them. And that's something, man. Because maybe the only real misfortune is to become corrupted. That's a really useful thing to think. Maybe the rest of it is trivial in comparison. I know that's a rough thing because you can be in very harsh circumstances, but I do think there's something to that. And you are not required to believe what I'm telling you, by the way. If you have an argument about why some of this doesn't make sense, then, follow that sucker, because I'm trying to tell you what I've reached with regards to bedrock presuppositions, and I haven't been able to put pry bars underneath them, but that doesn't mean you won't. And you should try. Anyways, and you might wonder about this sort of thing, if this kind of thing could possibly be true. Well, that's why I have you read Frankl and Solzhenitsyn. They're not classic personality theorists, but it doesn't matter to me because they're getting at something that's deeper than the terror management theorists or the people who deal with positive illusions. They're trying to make a case based on the analysis of an entire bloody century. And the case is, society has become carnivorous and pathological in precise proportion to the degree that the individuals who make up that society become deceitful and irresponsible. And I've never encountered a political or economic analysis or claim that has anywhere near the power of that.
But it's a terrifying proposition, even though what you get out of it is, well, your life is meaningful.
Belief systems structure your perceptions. Value systems, we're going to call them value systems. They structure your perceptions, and they also guide your actions, because you act in accordance with your values, conscious or unconscious. You have values that you don't know about because you just don't know yourself very well. You can tell that you have values that you don't know very well, because sometimes you get attracted to people that you know perfectly well. That's a mistake. Or you're trying to tell yourself to study and you don't. Sub-personalities, and they're more or less directed towards a single goal, but it depends on how committed you are to that goal, how much you've thought it through, how much you buy into it, how many of the contradictions in your world representation you've managed to iron out, and all of that. So, but in any case, it's value systems that govern action and perception. And so then I started thinking about what a belief system was. And I realized that a belief system was actually a set of moral guidelines. And moral guidelines are guidelines about how you should behave, also how you should perceive. And the reason that a moral guideline is necessary for you to perceive is that you can't look at anything without a hierarchy of value, right? And so what that means is you can't even look at the world without a value structure. It's chaos if everything is equally unimportant, or if everything is equally important. It's chaos. And so a value system structures the very way that you perceive the world. And I don't mean that metaphysically. There's plenty of experiments that have demonstrated that. The other thing I've noticed is that I've been talking a lot to the crowds that I've been talking to, not about rights, but about responsibility, right? Because you can't have the bloody conversation. What are you doing? You can't have the conversation about rights without the conversation about responsibility, because your rights are my responsibility. That's what they are, technically. So you just can't have only half of that discussion. And we're only having half that discussion. And the question is, well, what the hell are you leaving out if you only have that half of the discussion? And the answer is, well, you're leaving out responsibility. And then the question is, well, what are you leaving out if you're leaving out responsibility? And the answer might be, well, maybe you're leaving out the meaning of life. That's what it looks like to me. It's like, here you are, suffering away. What makes it worthwhile? Rights? And the reason that the postmodernists can't let go of neo-Marxism is because there's no impetus forward in postmodernism. That's its fundamental flaw. It's like, well, there's no grand narrative. It's okay, like, what are you going to do tomorrow? Well, I don't know, because everything's the same as everything else. It's like, well, you cannot live that way. It's impossible to live that way. Well, we'll just sneak some Marxism in the back door. It's like, well, that's prima facie evidence, in my estimation, that your philosophy is pragmatically lacking. Even though you can make a perfectly coherent case for it, it's like you can't live it out. You just can't do it. So you have to sneak in this pathological Marxism in the back door. Well, no, that just invalidates your entire system. But apart from all that, I think the postmodern objection to meaning is actually wrong. Well, we talked about this earlier. I do believe that there's a transcendent ethic. And I do believe that it touches on the metaphysical. And he said two things in his inimitably wise manner. The first thing he said is, beware of unearned wisdom. It's like, yeah, man, that's great. And he also said, you have to be very careful about entering the realm of the gods, because you end up with a responsibility that might be more crushing than you can tolerate. And it's the same kind of idea. And I thought, I've never read anyone who wrote wiser words about the dangers of psychedelic use than that. Because he didn't say, well, none of this is real. He said, it's more real than you want it to be. And so watch the hell out. And I think that's extremely good advice. And it is very difficult for people to integrate those experiences into their life.
First principles all the time. When people talk at the top of the iceberg, then it's impossible for them to even see sometimes that they're actually standing on two different icebergs, right? They're not seeing the commonalities of and they're not seeing what's different. Like if I argue first principles with somebody, then you can see how those first principles manifest in political differences in the business that I'm in. But if you're just arguing about a certain political policy without examining anything that goes underneath there, then you just end up clubbing each other and not even understanding what the other person's saying, because you don't understand the set of values they're deriving those political principles from.
Part of the problem that we have right now in our culture is trying to diagnose the level at which the discussion should be taking place. And
it all comes together. I mean, there is no such thing as apolitical, but by the same token, there's no such thing as aethical, right? I mean, if you are operating in the sphere of politics, you are going to end up, if you dig deep enough, in the same waters that Jordan is used to being. And if Jordan elevates, up on that chain far enough, he's going to end up in the sphere where I'm used to operating, which is
move from being a child dependent into the world. But you don't move from child to individual. You move from child to group. That's your teenage gang. That's your adolescence. You have to catalyze your group identity. If you don't have a group identity, it's actually a developmental failure, right? But then you might think, well, wait a second. Group identity is necessary, but is it the highest? Does it represent the highest plane of moral achievement? The answer to that is no. You have to emerge from your group as an individual. Okay, so now this is how I read the Christian story symbolically, and this is a consequence mostly of having studied Jung. He said, look, you need group identity. That's the persona that you wear. You have to have a persona. You have to be able to wear a suit. You have to simplify yourself for other people. You have to be able to play the game. Right. Otherwise, you just have failed developmentally. But if you're only a persona, then that's a big problem, partly because when the group goes insane, so do you. Okay.
gravitate toward the light like moths.
Well, it's partly because the problem with relativism, let's say that did produce a radical state of equality. Well, the problem with that is that there's no up. And the problem with there being no up is there's no hope. And the problem with that is that people actually live on hope.
Yes.
So if you flatten out the value structures so that there's no qualitative differentiation between things, then there's nothing to do. So that's just not helpful. And so then you can tell people, look, make no mistake about it, there is down, that's hell, that's Auschwitz, that's the gulags, like that's down, that exists in your own family. You can create that with no problem. And because there's a down like that, there's also an up, and the up is worth aiming at, even though it differentiates people as they climb towards it. It's still, without that, you can't have the purpose in your life that gives it meaning and nobility in the face of suffering.
Would be you take 10 admirable people and you pull out someone who's meta-admirable, and that's a hero. That becomes a religious figure across time. That becomes a savior, a messiah across time, as we conceptualize what the ideal person is. And in the West, here's how we figured it out. We said the ideal person, the ideal man, is the person who tells the truth.
I read a fascinating interview with you, and you were talking about the plight of young men and how guys really need to get their act together. You went on to say the lack of an identifiable and compelling path forward and the denialism these kids are being fed on a daily basis and undoubtedly destroying them, and that is especially true of the young men. This show we've covered widely the fact that suicide is the biggest killer of young men under the age of 45 in this country. It goes on in that interview to say, at this point, to my astonishment, Peterson begins to weep.
Yeah, well, it says, see, now it did it to me again. Look, last night, I was at this talk I gave, and about 1,000 people came, and about 500 of them stayed afterwards, and most of them were young men, and just one of them after the other comes up to me, and they shake my hand, and they say, look, I've been listening to what you've been saying for 6 months, and it's changed my life. It's like I was depressed, I was addicted to drugs, my relationships weren't working out, I was hopeless, I didn't have any goal. I started cleaning up my room and telling the truth and working hard on myself, and it's really working, and I just want to thank you for helping me. And I think, God, it's so sad that so many of these men, they've not had an encouraging bloody word, a real encouraging word in their entire life. It just takes a little bit of encouragement and care so that they're willing to set themselves straight to some degree and start trying. It's just a catastrophe that's so rare in their lives. And so, yeah, well, every time, because I see the same thing when I'm talking. My audiences are often composed mostly of men between, say, 20 and 35. Not exactly young, but young enough. And they're desperate for a discussion about responsibility and fair play and noble being and working properly in the world. And to hear the idea that their lives actually matter, that if they straighten themselves up and fly right, that they'll have a beneficial effect on themselves and their family and the community, and that the world is starving for that. And for them as individuals, not for them as a group, but for each of them as individuals. So, Yeah, it breaks me up. Every time the topic comes up, it breaks me up because it's so damn sad. And we're so stupid. We're alienating young men. We're telling them that they're patriarchal oppressors and denizens of rape culture and you know, tyrants in waiting, and we fail to discriminate between their competence and their tyranny. And it's awful. It's so destructive. It's so unnecessary. And it's so sad. And so whenever I think about it, especially because of all that I've seen of it, it makes me sad, like deeply. It's so sad.
Why has it happened?
Oh, God, that's a complicated question.
Humans are the flaw in the utopian system, right? I mean, you can't create utopia because we're part of it and we're not perfect.
Well,
so the idea of the perfect system created by an imperfect creature, us, it actually doesn't even stand to reason.
Yeah, well, and you can't also blame our imperfections on the imperfect social structure, which is, of course, what the Marxists tend to do, because it doesn't help. It's like, okay, the social structure is imperfect. Well, who produced that? It just pushes the question back one step.
Us.
You know, and so while I said at the beginning of this that I'm not specifically political, and I haven't been addressing everything that's been going on, except when I drift, I would say. Politically, I think instead, no, the right thing to do is, this is why I'm a psychologist, it's like the right level of focus is the individual. Those who have everything, more will be given, and from those who have nothing, everything will be taken. It's really a vicious statement. But what it means is, as you go downhill faster and faster. And people know that. It's like, it isn't linear, man. It's exponential. You do one thing, stupid, then 2 stupid things happen, then 4 stupid things happen. And, you know, before you know it, you're done. But the reverse of that is also true. You do one good thing, and then, you know, you get 2 opportunities, and you fix them up, and you get 4. And this is how the world works. It's a fundamental economic principle. You know, people talk a lot about self-esteem, which is it's very badly conceptualized self-esteem, because it's come to mean you should feel good about yourself, which I don't believe. I think you should feel good about who you could be if you got your act together. And you shouldn't be feeling so good about who you are now in your sorry state. It's like, what the hell, man? You're 17. Don't be feeling too good about yourself. Get your act together and see what you could be and feel good about your trajectory.
Talk about the fact that people would not have thought of building a movement on notions of truth and responsibility. That's because I think for a long time, people just took it for granted that we all agreed on these things. But there's been an actual forcible counter movement for generations now against both truth and responsibility. The idea is there's no objective truth. It's socially defined. We can make it up as we go along. There's no telos, right? I talk a lot in the new book about a teleological way of thinking, this idea that you actually have a purpose for which you were created, and that it's your job to fulfill that purpose. And that's completely been left by the wayside. So there's no truth. There's no capacity even, right? The scientific materialist worldview actually robs you of the capacity to even change yourself. Right? The studies that I've seen suggest that if you believe in a certain form of determinism, if you believe in hard determinism, you're less likely to go out and actually change your life and make it better because you buy into your own philosophy. And I think that as a society, we've sort of bought into that we're all victims of our own biology, victims of our own race, victims of our own ethnicity or our situation, and there's no way for us to get out of that, so we may as well throw up our...
To me, I've often thought that the most real thing is pain. And then you might say, well, if there's an antidote to pain, that would be something that would be even more real than pain. And it seems to me that the sense of meaning that I'm talking about here that's associated with this sense of ultimate responsibility is an antidote to pain, and therefore is something that's most real. I don't see anything. You can make a metaphysical claim about that, and that's perfectly reasonable, but you don't have to. You can make a bloody hardcore scientific claim for that. And I think it's extremely difficult to refute.
Exactly. If they'll listen and cooperate with you and move towards a better future, great. If they don't pay any attention and they keep doing the same damn things over and over and they're not going anywhere and it's painful, then maybe the proper thing to do is say, you just have your misery. I'll go off and have my life. And maybe you'll wake up at some point in the future and think that's a better way of being. Because just putting up with it is, well, they call that enabling, right? You put up with that sort of behavior, you're providing tacit consent for it and even tacit approval. It's like, it's a bad idea. You have, I would say, both the right and the responsibility to surround yourself with people who are good for the best part of you.
So one stream of response that's quite remarkable is that many, many people tell me that when they listen to what I've been talking about with regards to these deep symbolic structures, that it's as if they already know it, but don't have the words for it. And that's exactly right. And I would literally say hundreds of people have said that to me. So say, well, you're reminding me of something I already know. And of course, that's actually the hallmark of archetypal thinking, because the idea of the archetype is the idea that your thinking is structured. Underneath it, like there's a structure underneath your thinking. And then your thinking can reflect that structure when you become aware of the archetypes. And then that kind of puts your conscious self-knowledge in alignment with who you most deeply are. It's remembering in the Platonic sense. And I think that you do experience a coming home, so to speak, when that occurs.
It's the truth that you're talking about. And it prevents us from getting to a conversation in which we can talk about the fact that religious texts, religions, are not mind viruses. They are adaptations to past environments. They do contain a kind of truth that isn't necessarily literal and is in general not literal. But none of them, no ancient religion is up to date for Google's algorithms being the hazard to civilization that it probably is. We need to figure out how to navigate where the ancestral wisdom is simply not up to the current challenges.
Okay, so let me modify that slightly, because I think it's true and not true. The stories are erroneous in detail and right in pattern. So, for example, there's an idea that one of the things that the mythological hero does is stand up against the tyranny of the state. Now, you don't have to specify the nature of the tyranny of the state in order for that to be a truth that's applicable across different contexts. Well, there's an archetype of perfection that pervades the West, and for the sake of argument, I'm going to call that Christ, the Christ image. It's something like that. That's the archetypal image. Now, we have a story about what Christ's historical life was like. Well, you can't have that life because you would have had to be in the Middle East 2,000 years ago. That's not your life. But what you can do is take the archetype and you can manifest it within the confines of your own life. And what that does is force you to undergo the difficult process of updating the ancient wisdom. And you don't just forego it. You can't, or you can, but you'll pay a massive price. And part of that will be social disintegration, because it's the past is alive enough so that those of us who inhabit its corpse aren't clawing each other to death while we're feeding, right? That's the critical issue. Now, it's not alive enough because the bloody thing could fall apart at any moment, and we need to be awake and alert in order to keep it updated and maintained. You're cursed so much now from when you're young with this notion that your active engagement with the world is part of what is destroying and undermining the planet and adding to the tyranny of the social systems. It's like, how about not so much of that, hey? Because it's too soul deadening. It's anti-human right to the core. And my sense instead is that, you know, if you were able to reveal the best of yourself to you in the world, that you would be an overwhelming force for good, and that whatever errors might be made along the way would wash out in the works. And that's the other thing that you see in the Abrahamic stories, because Abraham is not a perfect person by any stretch of the imagination. He's a real person, and he makes mistakes, but it doesn't matter. The overarching narrative is, you know, maintain your covenant with God, and despite your inadequacies, then not only will you prevail, but your descendants will prevail. It's like, great, that's really good news. About that's so pathologically wrong. And people are starving for the antidote. And the antidote is truth and responsibility, right? And it isn't because that's what you should do in some, you know, in some I know better or someone knows better for you what you should do sense. That's the secret to a meaningful life. And without a meaningful life, then all you have is suffering and nihilism and despair and all of that and self-contempt. And that's not good. And so it's necessary for men to stand up and take responsibility. And they all know that and are starving for that message. And the message is more that that's also a good thing to stand up and take responsibility, because discussion is about. But we've skittered off into these radical oversimplifications, which is something like, well, if you have more than another person, you're an oppressor and you're evil. And if you have less, it's because you're virtuous and victimized. And that's just a non-starter.
So you think that there's a real problem with like something like a universal basic income? You think it's a horrible idea?
Well, I think the idea that the solution is a basic income is not a good idea, because I think the problem is deeper than that. I don't think the fundamental problem is that people don't have enough money. I think the fundamental problem is that human beings in some sense are beasts of burden, and if they're not provided with a place where they can accept social responsibility, social and individual responsibility in an honorable manner, they degenerate and die. That's the opiate crisis in the West right now. Like, men who are men don't need money. They need function. And we've got a problem associated with Cain and the other associated with Abel. And that those attitudes are associated with heaven and hell. Well, we know that human beings can turn the world into hell. If you're a student of history, you have no doubt about that. And no matter how terrible you think the hell that people have created in the past is, if you read a little more history, you'll find something even more terrible. And people, of course, are afraid of the human capacity to turn things into hell. That's one of the things that underlies our environmentalism. We're afraid that our misbehavior will turn the world into hell. Well, we believe we can do that. Do we believe that human beings can turn the world into heaven? Well, that's a harder thing to believe, because there's a lot more ways that things can go wrong than there are ways that things can go right. So heaven's a much narrower thing to aim at. The status of highest God. That's the right way to think. See, the God idea, here's another way of thinking about it that's quite cool. I learned this from Jung, and you can take it for what it's worth. The highest ideal that a person holds, consciously or unconsciously, that's their God. It functions in precisely that manner. And people might say, well, I don't believe in God. It's like, well, it depends on what you mean.
Right.
Like, and I'm not being foolish about that. It's like, we're very complicated creatures, and we're run by all sorts of very strange things down there in the unconscious, and the Greeks thought we were the playthings of the gods because we serve lust, we serve thirst, we serve hunger, we serve rage, and those things all transcend us. So that's why they were gods. Rage, that's the war god. Well, why is it a god? Well, it exists forever. It exists in all people. It takes them over and directs their behavior. It's a god. Well, you can quibble about the details. No, it's not a god. Okay, fine. It's a psychological force.
Right. Do people get too hung up on that one word?
Well, they don't really. We have to think about it functionally to some degree. We have to think about what that idea means. We've had that idea forever. It isn't just some superstition. Jesus, we've got to be more sophisticated than that, man.
Right.
And that's partly, this is partly what I think is unfortunate about the new atheists, let's say, is they don't take the damn problem seriously. That's so interesting, and it's terrifying to realize that, which is why it's terrifying to realize the shadow, which is why people don't do it. It's no wonder they don't do it. It's a horrible thing to realize that you're human and what being human means. Like Christ to Satan, that's the human being. And you might say, well, those aren't real. It's like, okay, well, they're figments of the imagination that the human race constructed to describe themselves. Fine. Does that make it less frightening? I don't think so. So, and it doesn't make it any less frightening if you take those two extremes seriously. And you might say, well, who's going to take the Christ extreme seriously? It's no problem, man. Dispense with it. You try getting rid of the other side. See how you do with that. The things that they are avoiding and are afraid of, that they know they need to overcome in order to meet their goals, their self-defined goals. If you can teach people to stand up in the face of the things they're afraid of, they get stronger. And you don't know what the upper limits to that are, because you might ask yourself, like, if for 10 years, if you didn't avoid doing what you knew you needed to do, by your own definitions, right, within the value structure that you've created to the degree that you've done that, what would you be like? Well, there are remarkable people who come into the world from time to time, and there are people who do find out over decades-long periods what they could be like if they were who they were, if they spoke their being forward.
And they get stronger and stronger and stronger, and we don't know the limits to that. We do not know the limits to that. And so you could say, well, in part, perhaps the reason that you're suffering unbearably can be left at your feet, because you're not everything you could be, and you know it.
Anymore, because I don't look at the world that way anymore. I'm not a materialist anymore. I don't think the world's made out of matter. I think it's made out of what matters. It's made out of meaning. Look at it from the perspective of modern brain science. What we orient towards unconsciously, which means what captures our attention, is meaning, and it captures our attention before we know what it is. The brain acts as if the world's made out of information or made out of meaning. Heidegger, for example, German philosopher, was convinced that the world was made out of meaning, essentially, and that people's primary interaction with being was interaction with meaning. And that isn't what modern people think, because they're deeply materialistic. If you go back 400 years or 500 years and you look at what people meant when they said matter, which is what things are made out of, what they thought matter was isn't like what we think it is.
That is that, like, imagine that there's a pathological mode of being that's so terrible that when you enact it, you just die. A good drug addiction will do that for you. If you pursue that, meth addiction, pursue that for about 10 years, you know, and you'll descend to the lower levels of hell, and then you'll die. Right. Well, so then you might say, well, what's at the opposite end of that? What would be the final manifestation of a mode of life that was revivifying and healthy? How redemptive and rejuvenating would that be? And I would say the answer to that is that we don't know. We have no idea. And these ideas of death and rebirth are definitely true on the micro level. Like, so the developmental psychologist Piaget said, for example, that when you incorporated new information, however you did that, learning or conversation, that new information would exist in contradiction to something that you already presumed. And so that thing you presumed would have to disintegrate and die. And then something new would be born. Analyze the causal chains. Because you might say, well, why do you remember your past? Well, you might say, well, it's in order to have an objective, record of the past. It's like it has nothing to do with that. There's only one reason you remember the past. And that's to be prepared for the future. That's why you remember the past. And so what you're supposed to do is take the past and extract out from it wisdom. And wisdom is the ability to avoid stumbling blindly into ditches. And so you think, well, here's a time in my past I stumbled blindly into this horrible ditch and terrible things happened to me. It's like, okay, you need to take that apart. You need to figure out how was it that events conspired with your participation, voluntarily or involuntarily, so that terrible consequence emerged. You need to know why that happened and how you could react differently in that situation. And as soon as you do that, your brain will leave it alone. You never asked. People don't ask. And so life comes at them like random snakes, and they sort of fend them off. And life goes by, and things don't work out the way people expected them to. But a huge part of that is they didn't know where they were because they wouldn't look or didn't know that they should look. Ignorance and willful blindness, right? Two great catastrophes. And they never figured out where they wanted to go or why. Now, there's a problem with figuring out where you want to go. And the problem is that you make your conditions for failure clear to yourself. And people don't like that. So if you keep yourself in the fog, then you can't tell when you screwed up. Now, that isn't so good because you're still screwing up. You're just too blind, self-blind to notice. Although in the short term, that's less painful. If you make your criteria for success razor sharp, then you know every time you screw up. But that's great because then you could fix it. It's self-evidently the case that the world is too complicated for us to deal with. And that's one of the problems that we face on an ongoing basis. And then the question is, well, what do you do about that? And if you ignore it, it gets worse. So ignoring it doesn't work. And so we know what doesn't work. And so if ignoring it doesn't work, then attending to it might work. And then I found out with the Egyptians, for example, that Horus was the god of attention, and the same thing happened among the Mesopotamians with Marduk and his ring of eyes. It's like, what's the way to forestall the catastrophe of things falling apart? And the answer to that is by attending to them, voluntarily attending to them. And that slots very nicely into the hero mythology that promotes the idea that if there's a dragon in the whereabouts, in the neighborhood, let's say, that
hiding in the basement just makes it grow larger. It's time to go out and confront the damn thing. And I was going to try to live my life in a particular way. And that way was, I wasn't going to use my language to try to get what I wanted. Because maybe I didn't know what I wanted. Maybe I was wrong about that. But what I was going to do instead was tell the truth as clearly as I possibly could and see what happens. That's how you should live. You abandon everything else. You abandon everything but the truth. And you say, I'm going to formulate my words as carefully as I possibly can. I'm going to speak my own fundamental truth, and I'm going to let the world unfold around me however it will, on the assumption that that's the best possible outcome, no matter how it looks to me. And one of the things I've learned, and you should listen to this because it's the truth, the worst thing that you can do to someone is to lie to them. You don't lie to people. You don't lie to yourself, because it warps you. It warps the structure of reality itself. And you don't want to do that, because it'll kick back and take you out.
Is sort of a middle power, and it rises to power. So, and domination. And then a prophet arises and says, look, you guys, you're all successful now. You're starting to get corrupt. You're not paying attention to the widows and children. You're not running your state according to the superordinate principle. You might say, well, the superordinate principle doesn't exist. It's like, okay, keep running it that way and see what the hell happens. That's what the prophet says, usually at the risk of his life. He says that to the king. It's like, fine, you don't believe in God, you don't believe in the superordinate principle, let's say that, the superordinate ethical principle, no problem. Keep doing what you're doing. Let's see what happens. Well, what happens is Israel gets wiped out, and then for generations it's enslaved, or its population is being destroyed, and then it sort of climbs back up to power, and then it gets powerful for a brief period of time, and it gets corrupt, and a prophet comes up and says, remember that superordinate principle? The point is they had a warning, and the warning was that the rational mind liked to fall in love with its own creations. Right.
So the term intellectual, the problem is that it identifies one aspect, and it sort of defines one aspect of behavior and thinking, only one.
Yeah, it's the intellect.
It's not a
well, what
balance.
happens is it's like the intellect is raised to the status of highest God. That's the right way to think. See, the God idea, here's another way of thinking about it that's quite cool. I learned this from Jung, and you can take it for what it's worth. The highest ideal that a person holds, consciously or unconsciously, that's their God. It functions in precisely that manner. And people might say, well, I don't believe in God. It's like, well, it depends on what you mean.
Right.
And I'm not being foolish about that. It's like, we're very complicated creatures. And
Powerful meditation and prayer. If you wanted to be traditional about it, I would say you have to determine, this is a process of soul searching. What are you oriented towards? And the answer could easily be nothing. Well, this is why I produced the Future Authoring Program. You got to be oriented towards something, because otherwise you're disoriented. You just spin around in circles, and then you suffer. And so do people around you. It's not a good solution. Orient yourself towards something. You have to figure out what it is. What will work for you? What goal would justify the suffering of your life? Start trying to piece that together. You're going to get better at it. But it's a personal process. And you should use your education to inform that. So you need a personal place to stand, because otherwise you're going to be handed a place to stand on a plate. And it may be one that makes you a puppet of someone else's goals. Start taking control of yourself. See if you can stop saying things you know to be lies. That's not the same as telling the truth. You don't get to do that to begin with, because you're not good enough at it to even attempt it in some sense. But everyone can stop saying things they know to be falsehoods. They can use their own damn definition of falsehood.
Right, but in your definition, importantly, I think, in your definition, falsehood includes the higher level moral truth.
Yes, it's living wrong.
You can say something that is literally true, but of course, like you said earlier, it's a black truth in the sense that at a moral level, you're saying something to cause a social effect that is actually negative.
I would say, stop saying things that violate your conscience, instead of stop saying things you know to be untrue, because we run into the truth problem. But I would say, here's another idea. Stop saying and doing things that make you feel weak.
Just all you have to do is pay attention to that. Some things you do will make you feel disintegrated. It's a physiological sensation. Disintegrated and weak. It's something that Carl Rogers commented on. He thought about that as part of, now I can't remember the word. It's something like integrity. But that isn't the word he used. But some things improve your integrity and some things disintegrate you. Now, the things that disintegrate you, you often do to impress other people, or because you're taking a shortcut, or you're escaping what you know to be your moral obligation. And your moral obligation stems naturally from your aims. Like once you have aims, you have moral obligations. They come together because the moral obligation is what you need to do in order to obtain the aim. So, and if you don't have an aim, well then you're aimless, so that's not a solution. So along with the aims come the moral obligations. Then when you violate the moral obligations, you'll have a sense of that violation.
Where there's no avoiding them. And it's because they're true. But they're not true like scientific truths. They're a behavioral truth, or a pragmatic truth, or a dramatic truth. And part of the reason that our society is so damn unstable now, and part of the reason all this weird chaos is emerging, this is a consequence of Nietzsche's observation back from the late 1800s about the death of God. We blew the metaphysical foundations out from underneath our culture. And the whole thing is shaking and twisting. And it's vacillating between the horrors of the extreme right and the horrors of the extreme left. It's been doing that for 140 years, and we're in the throes of that again. We blew the metaphysical foundations out from underneath our culture. And we need to get them back. Part of the reason that people are so obsessed by things like the Avengers movies and the superheroes and Harry Potter and all of that is because, and Star Trek and Star Wars, is because our collective imagination is trying to regroup at the level of drama and reformulate our fundamental metaphysics.
To make a rational argument, you have to start with an initial proposition. Well, the proposition that underlies Western culture is that there's a transcendent morality. Now, you could say that's a transcendent morality instantiated in the figure of God. That's fine. You could even call that a personification of the morality. If you don't want to move into a metaphysical space, I'm not arguing for the existence of God. I'm arguing that the ethic that drives our culture is predicated on the idea of God, and that you can't just take that idea away and expect the thing to remain intact mid-air without any foundational support. Frustration, say, with people like Sam Harris, the sort of radical atheists, because they seem to think that once human beings abandon their grounding in the transcendent, that the plausible way forward is with a kind of purist rationality that automatically attributes to other people equivalent value. It's like, I just don't understand that. They believe that that's the rational pathway. What the hell is irrational about me getting exactly what I want from every one of you whenever I want it at every possible second? Why is that irrational? And how possibly is that more irrational than us cooperating so we can both have a good time of it? I don't understand that. I mean, it's as if the psychopathic tendency is irrational. There's nothing irrational about it. It's pure naked self-interest. How is that irrational? I don't understand that. Where's the pathway from rationality to an egalitarian virtue?
And it also points to something else that's of paramount importance, which is that there's an element of the human psyche that can die and come back, and die and come back. And that's what happens to you when you encounter a catastrophe and you make order of it and you climb back out of the underworld. And your voyage through life is punctuated by trips to the underworld. And so you're somewhere, and then you go outside that, and then you go somewhere else, and then you go outside that. And so what happens to people is they generally identify with where they are. Order. But order dissolves and collapses, and then it reconstitutes itself. So then you might say, if you were trying to adapt to the structure of reality itself, instead of identifying with order, you would identify with a process that allowed you to transform yourself across repeated bouts of order and chaos. And that's what these sorts of images are trying to represent. Look carefully that she's standing on a reptile and holding her child away from it. It's a common medieval Christian image. And you can think of it as divine because women spent an awful lot of time doing that with their children over the course of our millions of years of evolution. And it's something that's sacred because our species depended on that for its survival. This one's even better. This is a medieval image. I love this image.
So there's Mary with the Christ child, and she's standing again on a reptile, a predatory reptile. But in the background, you see all those weird little shapes? Those are musical instruments. And they fill space. And the medieval artist who drew this picture had this intimation that behind the manifestation of something as primary as the protective maternality of Mary was something like the music of the spheres, or a collection of harmonious patterns. It is not safe to speak, and it never will be. But the thing you got to keep in mind is that it's even less safe not to speak, right? It's a balance of risks. It's like you want to pay the price for being who you are and stating your mode of being in the world, or do you want to pay the price for being a bloody serf, one that's enslaved him or herself? Well, that's a major price, man. That thing unfolds over decades, and you'll just be a miserable worm at the end of about 20 years of that, right? No self-respect, no power, no ability to voice your opinions, nothing left but resentment because everyone's against you, because of course you've never stood up for yourself. It's like, say what you think carefully, pay attention to your words. The price is, it's a price you want to pay if you are willing to believe that truth is the cornerstone of society. And in the most real sense, if you're willing to take that leap, it creates order from chaos, and then sometimes turns pathological order into chaos when it has to. Don't underestimate the power of truth. There's nothing more powerful. Now, in order to speak what you might regard as the truth, you have to let go of the outcome. You have to think, all right, I'm going to say what I think, stupid as I am, biased as I am, ignorant as I am. I'm going to state what I think as clearly as I can, and I'm going to live with the consequences no matter what they are. Now, the reason you think that's an element of faith. The idea is that nothing brings a better world into being than the stated truth. Now, you might have to pay a price for that, but that's fine. You're going to pay a price for every bloody thing you do and everything you don't do. You don't get to choose to not pay a price. You get to choose which poison you're going to take. That's it. So if you're going to stand up for something, stand up for your truth. It'll shape you, because
people don't understand that postmodernism is a complete assault on two things. One, it's an assault on the metaphysical substrate of our culture, and I would say that the metaphysical substrate looks something like a religious substrate, so it's a direct assault on that. And the second thing it's an assault on is everything that's been established since the Enlightenment. Rationality, empiricism, science, everything. Clarity of mind, dialogue, the idea of the individual, all of that is not only, you see, it's not only that it's up for grabs. That's not the thing. It's to be destroyed. That's the goal. To be destroyed. Just like the communists wanted the revolution to destroy the capitalist system. It's the same thing. These people, now you might say, well, does every social justice warrior activist know this? It's like, well, no, of course not. It's not any more than every Muslim knows the entire Muslim doctrine or Islamic doctrine, or every Christian knows the entire Christian doctrine. Because what scientific truth tells you is what things are. But genuine religious truth tells you how you should act. And those things are not the same. And so a great story, like a great novel, which is a quasi-religious construction, because it's like a distillation of ordinary life into its most important elements. That's a map about how you should comport yourself in the world. And you might say, well, what do you mean by should? And because that's the question the moral relativists ask. And there's an answer to that too, as far as I can tell. And I got this partly from reading Jean Piaget. So imagine that here's how you should act. You should act so that things are good for you like they would be for someone you're taking care of. But they have to be good for you in a way that's also good for your family. And they have to be good for you and your family in a way that's also good for society. And maybe even also good for the broader environment, if you can manage that. In regards to religious tradition, on the one hand, you have to maintain the tradition. It's like maintaining the Constitution in the US. On the other hand, you have to be awake and alert, because the tradition is a dead thing, right? It was composed by dead people in the dead past. It can't respond as flexibly as it should to the demands of the present. That's up to you, and you do that with your vision, with your capacity to see, and with your capacity to articulate. And forever, really,
the major deities that mankind have produced, Marduk for the Mesopotamians, and Osiris or Horus for the Egyptians, and Christ for the Christians, and Buddha for the Buddhists. These have been people who are noted for their vision, for their ability to watch and pay attention, because there's nothing more important than the ability to pay attention. Pay attention and speak the truth, your truth. And that's how you keep everything stacked up in order harmoniously. That's how you keep the balance between order and chaos.
Nature, right? But nature is sort of outside our proper domain, right? That's partly why that idea infuses environmentalism. It's like environmentalism is mythology right to the core. It's like pure Mother Nature. She's a virgin, right? And she's being raped by the terrible father and his evil sons. It's like, yeah, true. But what about the good father and his good sons, and cancer, and, there was this horrible worm in Africa that used to burrow inside people's skin. Yeah, it's horrible. And it was just eradicated, eh? So some doctor took it upon himself to get rid of that worm. It's like, yeah, well, that's Mother Nature too, So environmentalism is an ideology because it only tells half the story. Of course, people are rapacious and horrible, and Mother Nature is beautiful and virginal. It's like, yeah, but she's also an absolute terror. And you better be thankful for the fact that you have a roof over your head.
The tragedy of life is too much for you to bear without becoming resentful and bitter and murderous and even genocidal. It means that you haven't picked up enough responsibility. Because if you picked up enough responsibility for the revivification of the state and the eradication of unnecessary suffering, you'd find enough meaning in that, so the idea of meaninglessness would vanish in an instant. You'd have more meaning than you knew what to do with. And that's a terrifying thing as well. But to fight off one terrifying thing, the specter of mortality and insanity and finitude and death, you need another monster of equivalent size. And that's one that you can find. And it's one that you can bear up, and it's one that you can live, and that's what we need to do, because if we don't do that, then all hell breaks loose. Really, eternally. That's what those stories mean. Logical roots of our culture, and people get upset with me because I bring in religious themes, but I understand some things about mythology and religion, and it's not an accident that the axiomatic Western individual is someone who was unfairly nailed to a cross and tortured. It's like, yes, right, exactly. So what do you do about that? Well, I thought about that for a long time too. It's like, well, you don't get together in a damn mob, because all that does is allow you to be as horrible as you could possibly imagine and suffer from none of the consequences. That's a bad idea. So how about we don't do that? Well, there's a deep idea in the West too. It's like, pick up your damn suffering and bear it and try to be a good person so you don't make it worse. Well, that's a truth. They aren't physiologically dependent anymore. But you let that person go, and the first thing that happens is his old friend, who he's always out doing drugs with, shows up, and bang, he's craving like mad. And that's because that thing in there is not dead at all. And it's activated by the cue. And it's a circuit. It's not. It's a personality. It only wants one thing. It wants cocaine. It's going to suppress any non-related thoughts, and it'll use lies. That's no problem, especially if lies have been reinforced, which they certainly have. Where are you off to, son? You'll have a lie for that, and then 10 minutes later you have your drug, and so that little lie has just grown. Or maybe you think you've tried to quit, and you think, to hell with it, and every time 10 minutes before you take your drug you think, to hell with it, and you do that 1,000 times. Well, believe me, the to hell with it circuit, that sucker is strong. You see that the people who are writing as existentialists are committed to what they say. They want to enact what they say in the world. It's romantic because it does involve emotions and motivation. See, with reason alone, Enlightenment view of reason was that reason and the passions were antagonistic, that all the passions could do would be to cloud reason, and that it was reason's job to lift itself up above the body and the emotions and clarify the nature of the world. The existentialists would deny that completely. They would say, no, it's that the purpose, the appropriate mode of being is to act properly.
And rationality can be a guide to that, but it can also deceive in all sorts of ways. The passions inform you. They don't cloud your reasoning, although of course they can, because they tend to be kind of single-minded, you know, they can take you off course. But that doesn't mean that they're enemies of rational clarity per se. Justifies sloth and cynicism. Well, the opposite is, yeah, what you do matters. It's like, well, why not believe that? Well, try believing it seriously and see what happens. You take the existential claim seriously. One of them is, you make a mistake, especially one that you know is a mistake, you will absolutely pay for it. And worse, that you'll never get away with it. And worse than that, it'll domino out into the world. So not only will you pay for it, but the people that you're connected with will pay for it. There's always a price. It's like, well, you decide which of those two things is more terrifying. You know, when you read Freud, and Freud says, religion is a defense against death anxiety. Well, that's a good argument. But it is not by no means clear to me at all that the reverse of that, which is the idea that things have intrinsic meaning and that you have like an intrinsic responsibility here when you're like 20. And the reason that people teach it is because they're more afraid that things might have meaning than they are afraid that things might not. Because you might ask yourself, well, here's two options. One is, it doesn't bloody well matter what you do. Who the hell cares? Who's going to know in 1,000 years? And everything's relative. Well, you think, God, nothing could be worse than that. Well, I can tell you something that would be worse than that. It's easy. Let's take the reverse. Everything you do matters. Okay, so what's the downside of that? It's like you don't get to get away with anything. Everything you do is important. It's linked to everything else. It's like, okay, now choose. You got a choice. You can either choose to believe, nihilistically, that nothing has any meaning. Well, you get to be depressed and anxious, and maybe you're impulsive because that's the only kind of pleasure you can find. But the advantage is, you don't have any responsibility.
These Marxist ideas are very attractive to compassionate intellectuals, and we don't have good, bad examples like the Soviet Union around that everybody can point to and go, yeah, well, that sounds good, but, you know, what about the murderous death camps and the millions of people who are suffering? We still have North Korea, but, you know, people treat North Korea like it's a joke instead of like it's an exemplar of a pathological system. And people have no historical memory, like my students. And that's partly because they're taught so badly in schools, is they have no idea what happened in the Soviet Union. They have absolutely no idea. They know a little bit about the Second World War, maybe. And, of course, people generally know about the Holocaust. But they have no idea what happened in the Soviet Union. So they have no idea where these ideas could lead. And the universities and the high schools are so full of people who are radically left-leaning that they're never taught any, the students are never taught any proper history. You know, they're taught about the evils of capitalism.
Right? Or in 100 years, or whatever. I can pick a time frame within which this event is irrelevant. Okay, so then you can derive from that fact that it's irrelevant. Or you can derive from that fact that that's a stupid way to think. So, and you can derive the conclusion that it's a stupid way to think if you haven't made thinking your God. So, and there's lots of other things that work better than thinking. Paying attention is better than thinking. It's much better than thinking. Paying attention allows you to listen to people who don't agree with you. Paying attention allows you to learn things that you don't already know. So, you know, if it's thinking or attention that should be the God, it's like attention rules. Thinking, that's a subordinate phenomena, but it likes to pop up on top, you know, because it likes its little tight theories and it likes to be right. Well, you know, forget that. You're not going to be right.
Different.
Yes, of course.
And
their truth is representational.
Right. So
yeah.
Can you elaborate maybe on this?
See, that's also partly why the Catholic Church historically has been so put off by the rational intellect. You know, like people like Dawkins say, well, you know, yeah, they went after Galileo because he was undermining their superstitions. It's like, yeah, partly right. The other part was Seth, like the figure of evil throughout history, is always the hyper-rational intellect. And the reason for that is the intellect is God's highest angel, so that's Lucifer.
And it falls in love with its own creations. It likes to make totalities out of its own creation. Once there's a totality, there's no room for the transcendent. There's no God. That's Satan's error, by the way. And everything immediately turns into hell. Now, you see, that was all put together particularly well by Milton.
You couldn't exist. You couldn't act. You have to hold on to the dogmatic structure of your belief, but you have to be open for its update on a continual basis. And that's basically what consciousness is for. That, seriously speaking, consciousness is the thing that attends to the unknown and to the anomaly and integrates it with the structure. And there's meaning to be found in that too. That's to boldly go where no one has gone before, you know, in the words of the Star Trek writers, and something that deeply appeals to young people when they watch that sort of thing. But so what the fundamentalists are doing is they're trying to hold on to their tradition, and it's no bloody wonder, because if the tradition falls apart, you end up isolated and drowning in the ocean alone. But if the tradition gets too intense and restricted, well then you're just clones in a prison, and that's these two forms of hell. In a sense, they meet. You know, if they get extreme enough, they meet. And you face it down. And in doing that, you free the virgin, right? That's St. George. He frees Virginia in the Harry Potter story. And maybe you half die because of that, because he gets bitten by that basilisk and just about dies. And then it's the phoenix that saves him, because the phoenix is the spirit of death and rebirth. These stories, they come up everywhere. There's no avoiding them. And it's because they're true. But they're not true like scientific truths. They're a behavioral truth, or a pragmatic truth, or a dramatic truth. And part of the reason that our society is so damn unstable now, and part of the reason all this weird chaos is emerging, this is a consequence of Nietzsche's observation back from the late 1800s about the death of God. We blew the metaphysical foundations out from underneath our culture. And the whole thing is shaking and twisting. And it's vacillating between the horrors of the extreme right and the horrors of the extreme left. It's been doing that for 140 years, and we're in the throes of that again. We blew the metaphysical foundations out from underneath our culture. And we need to get them.
You can think of God as an ineffable representation of the highest possible value. That's what monotheists presume. They don't really presume God's nameable, and even the Israelites presumed that God wasn't nameable. It's ineffable, but it's the ultimate value, whatever the ultimate value is. You don't know what it is, but you kind of have some idea. And the idea of offering yourself up as a sacrifice to God is the same thing as determining that your life will be guided by unshakable commitment to the highest good. And what that means is that it's no longer your state that's in charge, or it's no longer your ego that's in charge. It's not even you that's in charge. It means that your conversations with people are no longer going to be about convincing them that your viewpoint is right. It means that what your conversation is going to be about in your speech is about attempting to represent what you believe to be true in the most concise and clear possible manner, no matter what. The transcendent. And the biblical stories state very, very clearly, continually, that is catastrophically dangerous. That you always have to be aware that there's something transcendent that supersedes the domain of your knowledge. And what might you think of people who don't believe that? And well, they're totalitarians, because they believe that their belief is total. And we know what happens when people become totalitarian. What happens is you get the instant creation of something on earth that very closely resembles hell. And that was hammered home in the 20th century. And if you want to derive one lesson from the 20th century, it's that totalitarian states and totalitarian ideologies are not a good way to entrap or search after meaning. That's a mistake. People, they have no idea why does God want burnt lamb smoke? It's not obvious to modern people, but you know, your ancestors weren't stupid. They were dramatizing something. They were dramatizing this tremendous realization that no other creature has ever managed, which is that there are things you can do to your being that change the nature of reality. And if you do them properly, you can make reality better. It's mind-boggling. And they acted that out because they didn't really understand it. They noticed that if things weren't going right, you had to sacrifice something valuable. And that seemed to make God happy. Well, It might have been a firstborn calf or a firstborn son, for that matter. For modern people, it's more like an idea. You have to sacrifice an idea that you hold dear in order to progress. Because the ideas that you hold dear are exactly what are making you suffer.
Probably.
There's a scene in Pinocchio where Geppetto wishes on a star. Right? And what it means is he lifts up his eyes beyond the horizon to something transcendent, to something ultimate, because that's what a star is. It's part of the eternity of the night sky. And so he lifts his eyes up above his daily concerns and he says, what I want more than anything else is that my creation will become a genuine individual. Right? It's a heroic gesture because it's so unlikely. And that catalyzes the puppet's transformation into a real being. And we start as puppets. And so the trick is to get rid of your goddamn strings. And you remember in Pinocchio, he faces a lot of temptations. One is to be a liar. The other is to be a neurotic victim. Well, okay, so what you do is you lift up your eyes and you say, look, I would like being to progress in the best possible manner. And that's best for me, best for my family, best for society, maybe best for the world. Simultaneously, I would like to attain that. Whatever that is, that's what I want. You commit to that. Then you tell the truth. And then you can tell if you're telling the truth. You can tell it physiologically. And so this is something to learn. You watch what you say, and you will find out that some things you say make you come apart.